Good afternoon to those of you joining from North America, and good evening, Astrid and others from abroad. Welcome to the second of the 2020 Jacob D. Maendel lectures. My name is Jesse Hofer, and I am one of the organizers of the lectures. I'm also going to be moderating the question and answer session again today at the end. I'm joining you today from Silver Winds, my home community, where I teach in the middle years and high school as well. I'm going to be saying a little bit about the history of the lecture series and the purpose before I turn it over to Kenny. So the first lecture was held last year in Portage la Prairie and was delivered by Ian Kleinsasser of Crystal Spring Community. And it was part of our celebrations of the centennial of permanent Hutterite settlement here in Manitoba. The lectures have been published as a book and are available at the HB Book Center. The lectures attempt to cultivate something of Jacob D. Maendel's vision for the church as we understand it. This vision includes a deep appreciation both for the Hutterite tradition and for the broader Christian tradition. It's an openness to non-Hutterites and new ideas, a deep reverence for creation, and a boldness in putting faith convictions into action. Before I turn it over to Kenny today, I'd like to lead you in a prayer. Let's pray. Gracious and surprising God, we thank you for the cloud of witnesses that remind us that renewal and resurrection often come to us as an unexpected gift from outside our field of vision. We give thanks for the resurrection of 33 AD, which gives us hope that new life will come among us again and again today. Our world could really use some real renewal. We need a grounding tradition. Help us to be alert to resources and opportunities for renewal, to push back against the injustices of our world. We are also mindful today of the terrible loss suffered by the people of Spring Valley Colony, Alberta, where 3 young ladies drowned this week. Comfort the grieving brothers and sisters. May they find help and healing in your persistent and faithful presence. Bless our time together today. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Kenny?
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. It's good to see more and more participants join us as we progress here. Please remember to mute your mics because even ambient sound in rooms is picked up and causes some distraction. For those of you who have been at the lecture, this format will be very familiar to you. We will be maintaining a very similar structure. Astrid will speak for about 45 minutes to 1 hour, and then that will be followed by a Q&R, question and response period, where we will engage with the questions and the materials that she raises. Last week, we invited you to submit questions via the Zoom chat feature or menti.com. Although some of you used the Menti website, no questions came in. So that led us to believe that the Zoom platform is sufficient for getting your questions. So please use that feature, and a few of us will be monitoring it, and hopefully we'll be able to deal with as many questions as possible. So without further ado, let me introduce our speaker for this series. We are very pleased to have with us Dr. Astrid von Schlachter from Weierhof, Germany. Her main position that she holds at this point is to serve as the historian and director of the Mennonitische Forschungsstelle, the Mennonite Research Center, which is located in the Weierhof. She is also a lecturer at Universität Ravensburg. For most of her academic life, Dr. von Schlachter has focused in on Anabaptist research with a particular emphasis on the Hutterites. She's published at least 5 or 6 books that have Hutterite content, and today I want to feature a different one than I did last week. This book is called Verbrannte Visionen. And it's somewhat difficult to translate this title. It basically means, refers to visionaries who imagined a different world who were burnt at the stake, okay? And the subtitle is Erinnerungsorte der Täufer in Tirol. So this book deals with the places and the people that were tortured and killed for their Anabaptist convictions in the Tyrol. Let me show you this cover again. It is in German. There is no translation available of this book. And we have it here in the book center if anybody is interested in reading this. It is, if you've got fairly good German, it is a very engaging and very readable book. Her most recent book is called Täufer von der Reformation ins 21. Jahrhundert. That would translate as Anabaptists from the Reformation up to the 21st century. And this book is just being released this month. Dr. von Schlachter is also the president of the Mennonitische Geschichtsverein and the 500 Jahre Täuferbewegung Society that is preparing to commemorate the 500th anniversary of the Anabaptist movement. Dr. von Schlachter has been to Manitoba 5 times to visit various communities, and we had hoped that she would be able to come for this lecture series as well, but given the time in which we live at the moment, that wasn't possible. So from our scattered locations all over North America and in Europe, please welcome with me very, very warmly, Dr. von Schlachter. Astrid?
Yo, thank you. Just let me...
Lose.
Okay, well, greetings again from the Mennonitische Forschungsstelle, where I'm in again at a very warm day here at the Weiherhof. We were expecting some thunderstorms, but they haven't come yet. So let's see how the evening goes on. And I would like to begin the presentation today with a short summary of the lecture of last week. We had a lot of questions yet, and putting those together, I thought I give a very short summary of some reasons for the decline of the Hutterite Church in Moravia, because that was the main topic we were talking about last week. Why did the Hutterite Church decline in Moravia in the 16th century? First of all, there was a very tolerant atmosphere in Moravia in the second half of the 16th century. And this tolerant atmosphere created a climate in which the Hutterite community could prosper. The economy ran well, there were no hardships, no persecution. The Hutterites became rich and a prosperous. But precisely this climate of prosperity opened the doors for a neglect of the spiritual roots. Economic success became a determining factor for the community. Second, besides this, the church grew very large in the second half of the 16th century, mainly due to mission work. And obviously, in this growing community, a rather high percentage of people lived who enjoyed the good life and prosperity, but who did not stand on the spiritual foundations of the Hutterite Church. And third, the third reason was the upbringing of the younger generation. It was obviously not possible to get a special percentage of the children to become convicted church members. They just stayed Hutterite because they were born Hutterite. Church as compulsory thing. The reaction of the elders now was, on the one hand, to strengthen the piety and the spiritual life within the church. But on the other hand, they put a lot of emphasis on the ordinances of the church, which created an external system that suppressed the spirit more and more. It was all about conformity to the external system of rules. The spiral of conformity to norms spirit higher and higher. The rules were not followed, new orders were created, and thus the whole system became even more rigid. In addition, a process of hierarchization and institutionalization set in, which in turn ran counter to the idea of the lay movement that had marked the Anabaptists in the beginning. All these developments were the reasons for the spiritual decline of the Hutterites in the 16th century. Economically, the church continued to do extremely well. And even the expulsion from Moravia that we discussed today could not do much to the economic prosperity. Since, so to speak, the Hutterites were able to transfer or rebuild all that what they had achieved in Moravia one-to-one in Transylvania. This evening, I would like to describe in the first part the further development of the community of the Hutterites up to the 18th century. And then we will have a look at the Hutterites' context with other confessional groups in these times. But first of all, we are still in Moravia. As early as 1600, we can observe in Moravia that the situation worsened. Besides, the economy was still doing well. We have seen that. So the economy was that well that the Hutterites were increasingly perceived by the other craftsmen in southern Moravia as superior competitors. The community, it was said, would take the butter of the other craftsmen's bread. That's what we say in German. I hope you understand the term in English too. So they take off the butter from the other craftsmen's bread. They take away the orders and buy up everything. This is why in 1600 a resolution of the regional parliament forbade the Hutterites to establish further colonies, so that they would not be able to compete more with the craftsmen in the cities. The political situation also worsened. Confessional politics became more rigorous. Already since the second half of the 16th century, the Habsburg had established a Jesuit mission in Moravia, which aimed at turning Protestant nobles into Catholics. But the mission was also directed against the Hutterites. A testimony of this mission are the writings of Christoph Erhard and Christoph Andreas Fischer, which on the title have those copper engravings that I showed to you last week. The Hutterites were still protected by the nobles on whose estates they settled and in whose coffers they constantly flushed money. But the Jesuit mission was little by little successful. More and more nobles became Catholic in Moravia, which widened the confessional divide and strengthened the influence of the Catholic Church in Moravia, and thus also the influence of the Catholic Habsburgs. And this had now an impact at the beginning of the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War started in 1618, and with the beginning of this 30 Years' War, after the battle at the White Mountain near Prague, all Protestants and Anabaptists in the Habsburg lands were subjected to massive repression. I say all non-Catholic groups, because the measures, as one might think, these measures were not only directed against the Hutterites, but it was a general policy of recatholicization. In Moravia, the situation had become especially worse, because the nobles of the Bohemian lands had started a rebellion against the emperor at the beginning of the 30 Years' War. So in 1622, the manorial lords on whose estates Hutterites lived received the order from Vienna to expel all Anabaptists from Moravia within 4 weeks. though many nobles still tried to protect the Hutterites. They tried to protect them to the last. And some even continued to use the services of the Hutterites after they were driven out. Some even brought back Hutterite artisans, especially in secret. If one looks at the expulsion of the Hutterites in numbers, it becomes clear only about 10,000 Hutterites emigrated, which is probably only 1/3 of the church members at that time. So only 1/3 left and migrated. The rest of the Hutterites remained in Moravia and Upper Hungary. One has to say that in Upper Hungary, there had already been colonies established in the 16th century. Maybe some of you already visited those colonies. They can still be visited today, and you can see a lot of the old buildings there. They're called Velké Levare, Leveer, Großschützen, and Sabatisch. All of these are today in Slovakia. Thus, 2/3 of the Hutterites did not leave Moravia. They either stayed in Moravia and converted to Catholicism, or continued to live as Hutterites on the colonies in Upper Hungary. I now share my screen because I have not that many slides today, and Kenny will tell that maybe later I will give or distribute the slides the next week to all those of you who are interested. Okay. The Geschichtsbuch writes about this time around the 1620 years. The Lord had sent this distress to his people as a test and purification to reveal the proven ones. Many could not stand the test, especially the superficial and insincere, even though they had left Moravia. They were just like the children of Israel who left Egypt, but as soon as they were faced with suffering, disaster, hunger, and cold, thought about Egypt, where they had bread and plenty, and turned back, abandoning the Lord and his church. Many did not even leave the country, but left the church in Moravia. Most of these being people from the cardinal's estate, as mentioned above. Thus, the chronicle about that time in Moravia and the expulsion of the Hutterites. Thus, the expulsion from Moravia once again makes it clear that there must have been many in the Hutterite church who lacked an inner conviction with the congregation and the depth of faith conviction, and thus did not want to set out on the road to a new home. But the exiled Hutterites did not go into uncertainty, because even before the expulsion, they had received an offer to settle from the Transylvanian prince Gabor Bethlen. His motivation was that he wanted to strengthen the economy in his dominion or in his territorial lands with the high quality craftsmanship and reliable work of the Hutterites. So he had his own interests in strengthening the economy, because the Hutterites were known for their high quality craftsmanship and their reliable work. Bethlen Gabor offered the community good conditions. He granted extensive privileges. This was a very typical settlement policy of territorial rulers, as it was repeatedly practiced in the early modern period. A prince or sovereign invited subjects who were persecuted because of their faith, but who were known for their innovative and good work. They granted them land to settle in order to strengthen their own territory. This has been of benefit to the Hutterites in the early 17th century, and in the 18th century, it was several times the Mennonites who were invited to settle in a new area because of their innovative farming methods. Thus, persecuted heretics became sought after and welcome subjects. So one has to say it was rarely pure charity when persecuted groups were invited in early modern times. Mostly there were tangible economic interests behind it, just as was the case when the Hutterites settled in Moravia in the early 16th century. So the Hutterites in Transylvania and Upper Hungary. Probably just under 2,000 of the Hutterites driven out of Moravia went to Transylvania. under 2000. The rest were either still living or newly settled in Upper Hungary. Thus, from the 17th century, we have two centers of Anabaptist or Hutterite settlements that you can see on this map here. That's actually a Hutterite map made by one of you. And you see the two regions where the Hutterites settled in the 17th and 18th century. Upper Hungary, which is here, and Transylvania, Siebenbürgen, that's here. Both regions were quite far from each other. What the consequences of this we'll see a bit later. In the first half of the 17th century, the Hutterite community remained economically very strong. And I make that back again. And it remained true to its good name. Sources in Transylvania report that the Hutterite tanners and widowers, quote, work out the skins better than the local tanners. And the carriage makers would forge their sickles better than the native craftsmen. It was above all the work of the Hutterite hatters, clothiers, tanners, and shoemakers, as well as the wainwrights, the blacksmiths, locksmiths, and cutlers that contributed to the community's recognition. Hutterite pottery also remained in demand. Hutterite pottery makers not only made tableware, but also equipped numerous noble castles and estates with artistic tiled stoves. It is handed down that the Hutterites in Transylvania were also active in agriculture. They did farm the fields, they grew fruit and vegetables, and they were winemakers, as they had been in Moravia. But we also read of Hutterite shearers of sheep, and the Hutterites probably brought the Moravian sheep to Transylvania. Furthermore, also the Hutterite physicians continued to do their service in the houses of the nobility. From these times, we have a description of the Hutterites by a very famous author of this time, by Hans Jakob Christoffel von Grimmelshausen, who writes in 1669, and I have a quote again for you. This is a description of the Hutterites being published in the maybe most famous work by Hans Jakob Christoffel von Grimmelshausen, the Simplicissimus. First of all, they had great treasures and superfluous food, which they did not waste at all. No curse, murmur, nor impatience was felt. Indeed, no useless word was heard. Then I saw the craftsmen working in their workshops as if they had hired them out. Their schoolmaster instructed the youth as if they had all been his own children. Nowhere did I see men and women mixed together, but in each place I saw each gender or each sex doing its work in a different way. Elsewhere I saw the women doing nothing but spinning. That is more than 100 scrolls and spinning skirts in one room. There was one laundress, another woman making the beds, the third a kettle woman, the fourth a bowl washer, the fifth a waitress, the sixth had to manage the bedclothes, and so the rest all knew what they should do. And just as the offices were divided up among the women, so also among the men and young men, everyone knew his business. If one of them fell ill, he or she had a special kind of attendant, and all had a general medic or pharmacist. Though they seldom fell ill because of a good diet and good order, as I saw many fine men of high health and quite age among them, such as are rarely found elsewhere. But there was no anger, no zeal, no lust for revenge, no envy, no enmity, no concern for the worldly good, no arrogance, no remorse. In summa, it was such a lovely harmonia which seemed to be attuned to nothing else but to multiply humankind and the kingdom of God in all respectability. So the quote seems like a pendant to the quote I brought last week from the Geschichtsbuch, and I put that screen back. The image of an almost perfectly organized society. this time by an outsider, the poet Grimmelshausen. We do not know which Hutterite colony Grimmelshausen described. It is even not clear whether he himself was at a Hutterite colony at all, or whether he was only reproducing stories he had heard. But we can read from the quotation, the Hutterite church was also perceived very positively from the outside, which is extremely interesting and remarkable. However, if one looks a little closer at Grimmelshausen's description and puts it into the context of the time, and thus sees it against the background of the Hutterite situation, one has to say Grimmelshausen conveys a somewhat idealized image, which actually fits in with his intentions. For Grimmelshausen was always looking for a good and successful life, for the perfect society. And he shows his readers some of these, including the Hutterite one. But Grimmelshausen often remained in the utopian realm. What's the case here too? Because one thing one has to say, Grimmelshausen can only have described a Hutterite colony from the first half of the 16th century. Because only in the early days of the Hutterites in Transylvania, the community was still prospering. But even then, not everything was perfect. If we again, as last week, use the church ordinances as a source of comparison for this time as well, it becomes clear the Hutterites had taken all the problems they had had in Moravia with them to Transylvania. Church discipline was still not perfect, which left much to be desired, and the lovely harmonia which Grimmelshausen describes should indeed be unmasked as at least part utopia. In addition, the distance between Upper Hungary and Transylvania proved too great to effectively administer the church as a whole. Although there were good contacts all the time between Transylvania and Upper Hungary, it was far away from each other, but good contacts were there all the time. Hutterites visited each other and even helped each other in times of need. But to enforce common norms at such a great distance was difficult in the 17th century. The communication and the control of the adherence to the norms was logistically not easy. Let's have a look at the words of Andreas Ehrenpreis, one of the most famous elders who presided over the church at that time. He was actually elder from 1639 to 1662. Andreas Ehrenpreis repeatedly complained about self-interest, private property, and a rather lax life of faith in his congregation. Everything what we have heard before. In two letters of admonition from 1642 and 1649 to the congregations in Alvins and Bottok, so that's in Upper Hungary, Ehrenpreis complains that the services in the church were not carried out conscientiously and according to the ordinances. He continues that the members of the church no longer did fear God. Parents and schoolmasters were no longer role models for the children. Church members would show little regard for the ministry and for the preachers, scoffing at them and speaking contemptuously of them. The Hutterites were, and I quote that now in German, the Hutterites were urdrüssig und satt an dem Schatz ihres Heils und an dem Dienst ihrer Seligkeit. So that means they were disgusted and fed up with the treasure of their salvation and the service of their salvation. But criticism of the spiritual bias of the community also came from the midst of the church members. For example, from Benjamin Kengel, 1629 in Sabbatisch. He called on his fellow believers not to place so much emphasis on external rules and ceremonies, but to listen more to the Holy Spirit. So Kengel stayed away from the common prayer because he thought that this was, quote, a human habit and not driven by the Holy Spirit. He also criticized the Lord's Supper as being merely, quote, outward customs and ceremonies and orders. They would not be, quote, necessary for the righteous believer. And he classified baptism and the offices of the preachers also as a human institute. A critique that was directed against the central role that obviously ceremonies and rituals had acquired within the Hutterite church. Also later in the 18th century, there were repeated demands by Hutterites to make spiritual life more flexible and to consider which institutions were actually necessary and where change was needed. If one summarizes the statements of Andreas Ehrenpreis and the criticism that was made, one could say, until the middle of the 17th century, there were too many cultural Hutterites in the Hutterite church. Speaking from a point of religious sociology, the Hutterite congregation of volunteers who were inwardly convinced of the life and the faith had become a church. The characteristic of a church is that it has a certain percentage of members who do not really participate in the life of the congregation. For the big churches, perhaps they only come to the church services twice a year, which is actually not a problem in most churches. Not so loyal church members are simply kept on the membership roster. But in the Hutterite church, these developments had a different effect. Here, the spiritual, the social, and the economic life were much more closely intertwined. The people for whom faith was not important continued to live in the community of goods. They worked in the Hutterite economical system. They participated in communal life. But they lacked an essential basis for the establishment of the community of goods, namely the spiritual basis and the conscious responsibility to God. So some sand got into the gears of the Hutterite community of goods. But there was also, and this is the next chapter, pressure from the outside, because these internal problems were accompanied by an increasing external pressure. The wars. On the one hand, the 30 Years' War. On the other hand, the Turkish wars of the late 17th century and the time around 1700. Colonies were raided. Residents continued in captivity. Many of them were sold as slaves. The most famous story is that of the Hutterite miller Salomon Bürger that some of you might know. He traveled after captured Hutterites as far as Constantinople in the early 17th century. He was able to buy some of them out of captivity or slavery. However, he got into serious difficulties and conflicts with the elders of the church because of his action. Because this action first had been a private initiative. Because he wanted to save his own family that was deported to Turkey. And the elders did not want to tolerate this private initiative at first. Well, besides the wars, the plague claimed lives among the Hutterites in the 17th century. And after all that, the church had stopped their missionary work now in the middle of the 17th century. Though a last attempt was the establishment of a Bruderhof in Mannheim, German city here, just 1 hour east from here in Mannheim. They established a Bruderhof there in the 1660s and 70s. But this Bruderhof in Mannheim had to be abandoned again, since most of the Hutterites in Mannheim joined the Reformed Church. Thus, the external pressure on the Hutterite congregation was great. Tribulations and hardships were a daily occurrence. And in addition, there were internal conflicts. And they became more and more intense and increased in the late 17th century. A particularly tragic story shook the community in Alvins in the 1690s. Converted anti-Trinitarian Georg Geissi had joined the Hutterites. The anti-Trinitarians, they had a different belief than the Hutterites. They opposed the doctrine of the Trinity and the two natures of Jesus Christ. That means they were convinced that Jesus Christ only had a human nature and was subordinate to God the Father. So the Trinity did not exist for them. We know that in the 17th century, some anti-Trinitarians joined the Hutterites. And there were repeated discussions between the two groups. Well, this former anti-Trinitarian, Georg Geissi, who joined the Hutterites, rose very quickly within the community to become teacher and elder. But he soon left the congregation again. And the bad thing was, he took with him a large part of the congregation's property. As reported in the Klein Geschichtsbuch, Geissi took 6 or 7 carts away from the best common property. This means a huge outflow of assets for the Hutterite church and the community. All these developments had 2 main consequences. First of all, the number of Hutterites was decisively decimated around 1700. It is said that the Hutterite community in Alvins in 1738 consisted of only 36 souls. And some years later, it's nearly the same numbers in Sabatisch, some more or less 17 pairs only in Lever, in Alvins, and so on. So the number of the Hutterites decreased. Secondly, the foundations of the Hutterite faith were decisively and lastingly shaken. That led that the community of goods was abandoned. The congregation in Transylvania probably abandoned community of goods or gave up community of goods in 1707. It seems that especially the events around Georg Geissi were responsible for giving up community of goods. The community obviously never recovered economically. In Upper Hungary, community of goods was given up already in 1694 at the latest. Actually, we don't know the exact dates when all this happened. The later elder Johannes Waldner reports retrospectively on the events and only mentions again and again that the Hutterites now lived in private property. But he does not give an exact date from when on this was the case. The Hutterite church thus was decimated and personal and had given up essential foundations of faith. It is always difficult to write a what-if history or the what-if story. But one can probably say if the Carinthian Protestants had not come in this situation, the Hutterite church would have perished. And actually, most of you with all the names Waldner and so on, Hofer, all of you would not be Hutterites today. So the joining of the Carinthian Protestants in the 18th century. The political developments in Austria helped the Hutterites. A brief review or looking back, just as in Moravia, the Protestants in all other regions of the Habsburg lands had come under pressure in the 1620s. They too were urged to leave the country. However, not all of them did so, but many Protestants decided to lead a secret life of faith. Outwardly, they lived a Catholic life. Inwardly, they remained Protestants. These Protestants are called secret or crypto-Protestants, Geheim or Krypto-Protestanten in German. But in their villages where they lived, they were often not so secret at all. People knew full well that their neighbors were Protestants and one got along very well. Interestingly enough, even the authorities left these secret Protestants alone for a long time. It wasn't until the late 17th century that the pressure grew. And in the 18th century, a new persecution of these secret Protestants began. You have here, let me share the screen again. You have here a map of Austria, and you have here the southern regions of Austria, which is Styria, Carinthia, and then Salzburg here a little bit more north. These were the regions where many crypto-Protestants lived until the 18th century. And now, in the middle of the 18th century, many of them had to leave their old homelands in these southern parts of Austria. And many were deported to Transylvania, which is actually here. And here you have Upper Hungary, where the Hutterites also lived, as well as in Transylvania. So these crypto-Protestants were deported to Transylvania, including a group of crypto-Protestants from Carinthia who were sent to Transylvania in 1755. Destitute, very poor, because nothing worked very well with the deportation, they arrived in Transylvania looking for work, which they found at the Hutterite colony in Alvins. They learned about the life and faith of the Hutterites, and after a while, they were so convinced that they were baptized and became Hutterites. These Protestants brought fresh blood to the Hutterites. They revived the Hutterite faith and the Hutterite community in the middle of the 18th century. But this joining of the Corinthian Protestants caused fundamental political problems for the Hutterites, because it was interpreted and seen by the authorities as mission work, and the Hutterites were not allowed to do mission work according to the privileges that were granted to them at the beginning of their settlement in Transylvania. The consequences of this development will we discuss next week, but the relations of the Hutterites with the Corinthian crypto-Protestants lead me now to another chapter that became very important for the Hutterites in the 18th century. The Hutterites in their context with other confessional groups. Last week, I began my lecture by stating that the Anabaptists were an extremely colorful and diverse movement in the 16th century. One can say that all Anabaptists were convinced that infant baptism was not biblical and that only adults should be baptized as mature Christians, being able to confess their faith. But there were different opinions about many other topics, one of which was always non-resistance. What did non-resistance mean in concrete terms, in private and in political life? We will also see this a little bit later next week. Other issues were divorce, which was constantly discussed among Anabaptist groups, Trinity and the question whether Jesus Christ had a human or divine nature. That was what I described as the anti-Trinitarian perspective, but also some other Anabaptists believed in that. And another discussion was always community of goods. The various Anabaptist congregations held very passionate debates on these issues in the 16th century, often with a good dose of polemics. And the Hutterites also participated frequently. Though it must be said, the 16th century was generally a century of polemics, and so the Anabaptists were children of their time in this regard. As polemical and passionate as these debates were, they testified to the fact that the Anabaptists actually lived out their maturity. They looked in detail into the beliefs of other churches. They were engaged in getting to know other beliefs and then reflected on their own faith and justified it in long treatises, which stimulated all the discussions. Even in the 17th century, the various Anabaptist congregations continued to engage in lively discussions. A longer writing by Andreas Ehrenpreis gives some insights, the so-called Sendbrief. Ehrenpreis comments in this Sendbrief on current debates. For example, one chapter of the Sendbrief is devoted to the nature of Jesus Christ, divine or human or both. A discussion, as I said, that was held with the anti-Trinitarians. But the Sendbrief of Andreas Ehrenpreis is also a testimony of how the Hutterite elder tried to make mission work palatable, or he wanted to revive mission work again in his own community of faith. Thus, he expresses his wish that community life should be attractive to more people, or communal life should be attractive to more people, which brought the question of community of goods into the general Anabaptist debate. For other Anabaptist congregations felt that they were being brushed off by the Hutterite view that Christian life was only possible in community of goods. How necessary for salvation did the Hutterites consider community of goods? Many Hutterite texts, including that of Andreas Ehrenpreis, do not lack a certain ambivalence regarding the question of whether it is necessary for Christians to live in community or not. On the one hand, Ehrenpreis writes, many people would speak, he says, many people would speak and write against community of goods and state, quote, that community and living together is not necessary. But, Ehrenpreis states, there would be whole clouds of witnesses before our eyes that testify how important community of goods is. Ehrenpreis was convinced that communal living was the sign of the true people of God and that they should be recognized by living communally. It is not always easy to classify such statements correctly. Is the true people of God therefore only those which live in community of goods? Ehrenpreis, on the one hand, agrees with this when he states that communal living is godly righteousness and thus required by all who call themselves Christian. On the other hand, he also weakens such statements, again when he writes in another passage that the Hutterites are wrongly accused of turning community of goods into violence, coercion, and urge. One should not force anyone, but, as Ehrenpreis states, quote, whoever is not forced by love, knowledge, and the Spirit of God shall not live in community of goods. Ehrenpreis also writes that communal living is, quote, not highly necessary for salvation, but it helps, or it would help to reduce and focus Christian life on what is necessary. Only in community, right love could be practiced. Love in words and deeds. Where there is no community of goods, there is, quote, only a stiffened brotherhood and a whitewashed love in words. All these statements and all these arguments lead Andreas Ehrenpreis to call for the mission to start missionary work again, because it would be important to gather all believers under the roof of community of goods. Following these words, Ehrenpreis adds the very interesting reports about the union of some congregations of the Swiss Brethren from the electoral Palatinate with the Hutterites in the 16th century. These congregations of Swiss Brethren had moved to Moravia in the second half of the 16th century as whole congregations and had joined the Hutterites. And furthermore, something else can be read from the writings of Andreas Ehrenpreis. An openness to perceive and to get to know other notions, to get to know notions from other Protestant writers. There are various Protestant authors he frequently quotes in his writings. For example, Johann Arndt and Johannes Piscator, two Protestant authors. They were not foreign to Andreas Ehrenpreis, and he frequently quotes them. I'll leave out a short chapter on the contact of the Hutterites with the Mennonites, because that fits very well to the lecture next week. And for the remaining minutes, I want to take you into the context of the Hutterites with another confessional group, with the Herrnhuter Church in the 18th century. The Hutterites had, over the whole 18th century, they had several times where they had good contact to the Herrnhuter Church. The Herrnhuter Brüdergemeinde goes back to a Saxon Count Nikolaus von Zinzendorf, who had founded a religious community in some villages west of Görlitz, that's in the very eastern part of Germany. These villages west of Görlitz took in many refugees, mainly from Bohemia and Moravia, mainly expelled Bohemian brethren who went actually back to the Hussites of the 15th century. Zinzendorf granted them refuge on his estates, which was the starting point for the Herrnhuter Brüdergemeinde. And on the poster of the lecture today, you see the logo of the Herrnhuter Brüdergemeinde. Today, the Herrnhuter Brüdergemeinde is known in the English-speaking countries as Moravian Church. In Germany, we still say Herrnhuter Brüdergemeinde. Nikolaus von Zinzendorf and his brotherhood were part of a renewal movement that had shaped the Protestant churches since the 17th century, which is called Pietism. In the 18th century, Pietism also gave very many influences and stimulated many Anabaptist groups, including some Mennonite congregations, but also the Hutterites. Pietism goes back to Philipp Jakob Spener, a Protestant theologian, and his essential work called Pia Desideria, published in 1675. In that book, Spener demanded to strengthen again the inner piety, to revive the Lutheran Church that had become very orthodox at that time. He called for a more deeply edification of the Church. And to further this, he proposed the establishment of so-called Collegia Pietatis. These were Erbauungsversammlungen, gatherings for personal and mutual edification, almost maybe like the reading circles of the early Anabaptists I had mentioned last time. In these Erbauungsversammlungen or Collegia Pietatis, people met, they read the Bible together, and they prayed together. And Pietism furthermore promoted an openness of congregations and churches for other beliefs on the basis of faith in Jesus Christ. So also the piety of the Herrnhuters aimed at a very internalized piety, which at the same time placed the maturity of the believers at the center. Furthermore, the Herrnhuter Brüdergemeinde was characterized by a great desire for communal living. Though the congregation did not live in community of goods like the Hutterites, but it had a comparatively extensive community organization. The Herrnhuters lived and worked very closely together. The church members lived in separated groups and thus experienced community on a basic level. Communal living that the Hutterites perceived as being similar to their own community. As I said, in the course of the 18th century, there were repeated contacts between Herrnhuters and Hutterites, whereby the connections of both congregations were sometimes more intensive, and then one did not hear from each other for a long time, and at some point the connection was revived again. From the Hutterite side, the contact to the Herrnhuter Brüdergemeinde was motivated by the desire to find a related faith community in times of distress. To be strengthened, as they said in their letters to the Herrnhuter, to be strengthened in their faith through relationship with others, to get encouragement and edification. One small incident is very revealing in this regard. It led to a renewed contact with the Herrnhuter Brüdergemeinde in the 1770s, after relations were on hold for a long time. It all had started in the 1720s, then the two churches had limited contact, then it was given up again, and in the 1770s, the relations were reactivated again. At that time, the Herrnhuter had a settlement in Sarepta, which is now today part of Volgograd in Russia. An officer had come from there, visited the Hutterites, and told them that a Christian community would gather in the Russian government of Astrakhan, where Sarepta was located, quote, in the spirit and according to the rules of the First Apostolic Church. The Hutterites became very interested and wanted to know more about this communal church there in Eastern Russia. Thus, the elder Hans Kleinsasser wrote a letter to the Herrnhuter preacher in Sarepta and asked first of all how important community was to them, whether, quote, it was a right communal church or not. Though there was only one short answer from Sarepta at that time, and the contact was not much more intensified at first, but one sees which aim or what the wish of the Hutterites was to find another communal church. Only later, around 1800, did the relations be revived again and lasted then for a longer time. And then, as we can see from the sources, the Hutterites even thought about joining the Herrnhuter Brüdergemeinde. This did eventually not happen, but both churches exchanged ideas about the foundations of the respective other congregation. They sent back and forth church records and creeds, writings, letters, and also reported on the problems in their congregations. So it says in the report of the Herrnhuters, so around 1800, that the Hutterite elders would have complained about the bad candidates for the succession in the office of the Diener des Worts and about their isolated situation at that time. This isolated situation of the Hutterites, it is said in the Herrnhuter report, made them actually open for a union with the Herrnhuter church. The Hutterite elder, it is said, was convinced of the old and close kinship with the Herrnhut brethren. But on the other hand, which is very interesting, Johannes Waldner also vehemently rejected a kinship with the Mennonites. So he saw himself more in common with the Herrnhuter Brüdergemeinde than with the Mennonites at that time. Very remarkable is also a passage from a letter that the Hutterites had already written to the Herrnhuter in the 1720s, which shows that the Hutterites were really looking for another congregation. And they said, quote, "We have noticed with great affection that God does not leave himself unproven among you, and that you try among yourselves to come close to the organization of the first church." That's what the Hutterites write to the Herrnhuter. And they go on, "This is also our goal, but it is not the main thing for us. Rather, we seek to base ourselves and others on Jesus Christ and to experience in our hearts the procreation from above, from the eternal or everlasting seed from which the sonship of God comes." And now comes a very interesting statement that the Hutterites write: "We believe in an invisible church of Jesus Christ in the Spirit." This last statement, "we believe in an invisible church of Jesus Christ in the Spirit," is very interesting because it follows ideas of Nikolaus von Zinzendorf. He was convinced that all true believers are united in Jesus Christ beyond all confessional boundaries. This idea was basic to the so-called Philadelphian movement in the 18th century. Referring to Revelation 3 and the letter to the church in Philadelphia, all true believers should be united in brotherly love. Not only Zinzendorf was attached to this idea, but also among the Mennonites were followers. So Zinzendorf had also a lot of contacts to the Mennonites, especially in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands, and then further south in Neuwied, and also here in the Palatinate. And obviously, also the Hutterites were not averse to believe in brotherly love that transcended all confessional boundaries. But as I said, there was never a union of the Hutterites and the Herrnhuter Brüdergemeinde. But there was a lively interest in the respective congregations, and it is said that Johannes Waldner read various writings from the Herrnhuter Brüdergemeinde, was very interested in them, read them as it is said, or as he self wrote to the Herrnhuter with great approval, and kept good contacts with the Herrnhuter Brüdergemeinde. As I see that we are near the end of our lecture today, and that we leave some more time for questions, Let me summarize a little bit the story of the Hutterites in the 17th and 18th centuries. This story, or the history of the Hutterites in the 17th and 18th century, shows the Hutterite church in a struggle actually for the right path. The outward conditions were hard. There was a lot of distress, wars, plague. The Hutterite church was reduced to very not many members anymore, and only the joining of the Corinthian Protestants revived the church, revived the system again. But if we look more detailed into the church, we see that they struggle for the right path. The path between traditions and rules that had emerged, and the adjustment of the rules to changing surrounding conditions. Now in the 18th century, we have different conditions than the 16th century. Renewal was needed, but the question is always how. For the Hutterites, it becomes clear again and again that it proved to be difficult to balance the spiritual and the temporal. Both was very important in this very close community. The spiritual and the temporal, how to balance both. And thus also to bring into balance the communal and the individual. In a letter the Hutterites wrote to the Mennonites in 1665 that I will deal with next week, there's a very nice sentence that I would like to quote. The Hutterites state in that letter to the Mennonites that one should endeavor, quote, to bring such a community into proper Christian order, to bring both the spiritual and the temporal to perfection, and to put them to work in a real way. And how to deal with the heritage of the church. The Hutterites had an enormous stock of old writings in the 18th century. Creeds, accounts, letters, sermons, songs, and orders that helped them again and again. All sources dating back to the 16th century to the early 17th century. These old writings helped to ensure that the church never fell apart in the past nearly 500 years. The church never was given up. But on the other side, this heritage was also a burden, because the reference to these texts could also hinder renewal. The danger is to transfer a historical system one-to-one into present times, without having checked if it is still appropriate. The skill in dealing with traditions, rules, and regulations is not to throw everything old completely overboard, but also not to submit to the old completely. Every church constantly needs renewal. For all these situations, one sentence can help that serves as headline for our lecture today. Prove all things, hold fast to that which is good. This sentence from 1 Thessalonians 5 cannot only be applied to the various interdenominational contexts of the Hutterites in the 18th century, but, and this is my last quote for today, Johannes Waldner, the elder of the Hutterites in the late 18th century, also uses that sentence from Thessalonians, uses it with regards to the orders and ordinances of the Hutterite community. In the Kleingeschichtbuch, he draws the following conclusion at the end of the 18th century, quote, after Brother Hans Kleinsasser had died and Matthias Hofer had left the community, the order of worship they had introduced began little by little to lapse and disappear. I do not mean to commend this neglect, nor am I glad for it. The gatherings for prayer, and especially the reading at midday help build up the young people's faith. As previously described, each read in turn, and so each was involved, and it often led to a talk about the meaning of a passage of the Bible. At that time, each one took pains to be able to read out the scripture fluently, and such a practice should still be used with a good conscience today. Now, each young brother wants to have a good, well-bound Bible with big print, but many of them, always excepting the zealous, know little of what is inside. Paul taught in 1 Thessalonians 5:2, "Prove all things, hold fast to which is good." It would have been possible to drop what was unnecessary and exaggerated and to keep what was good. But each can judge the matter as he sees fit. It is a good statement, and you can read that afterwards in the Klein Geschichtbuch if you want. It's a good statement for the end of this lecture. And actually what is behind that statement and what's the story of Hans Kleinsasser and Matthias Hofer, that's something, one part that we see next week in the lecture. And thanks now for your attendance, and we open everything for the questions.
Thank you, Astrid. I assume that a lot of this history will be fairly new for many listeners. So I anticipate a vigorous Q&A here. Let's begin with Kenny's question. Kenny wants to know what are the sources you used for Ehrenpreis's engagement with Benjamin Kengel? Do we have more than the excerpt that's published in the Epistelbücher?
Well, it's actually in the Chronicle. There is a small part that's mainly the source for what I told today. But I mean, there is a longer writing about Benjamin Kengel, and as far as I know, it has never been transcribed.
Okay.
May I follow up with a question where that codex might be?
Well,
I've recently had questions about this, which is why I'm asking such specific and questions.
Yeah, I know that I have a copy, a scan, but I'm actually not quite sure where I got it from. I would have to look that up again. Maybe Goshen, but I'm not quite sure, or I have to see if we in our Forschungsstelle maybe have a copy of this. But you're welcome to transcribe it, because I never transcribed it yet, and I'm actually myself curious what's written there.
So Astrid, when I think about the Corinthians coming to join the Hutterites at Alvins, I see this old tradition-bound, demoralized community that had fallen apart earlier. And here are these new crypto-Protestants coming along, and they're probably pietists in a sense, right? And they're reviving the community life once again. And I'm wondering whether these two groups were in tension during the attempt to revive community in the years after, in terms of a vision for the community. Because these old Hutterites would have had very firm ideas about what it should look like. These new converts were zealous and had their own ideas. Can you talk a bit about the tensions that developed in the community shortly after the Corinthians joined?
Well, I mean, actually, the reviving of the community life in Transylvania did not last very long, because they were expelled quite soon. Maybe you can. Well, we had short tension, though the Corinthians they were very open for the Hutterite system. I mean, if we talk about the sources and the writings, the Hutterites gave the Corinthians some of the old writings they had from the 16th century. The Übrigen Brocken is the writing that stemmed from this time when the Corinthians joined. It contains of several writings from the 16th century, and so the Corinthians knew quite well, or were very open to take in these new ideas. But then actually, if you take the time a bit further, you can see that the crypto Protestants, they were, I think, in part pietist. We know that they read pietist writings in Austria when they were still there. But they, and actually, you can also see this in Johannes Waldner's notions, and even in Johannes Waldner's language, that he was very influenced by Pietism. The words he used, the notions he had in his writings. But I mean, he was a perfect example that he was a Hutterite par excellence. There was no discussion with him about community of goods. But then at the end of the 18th century, there was a question about community of goods. There were splits among the Hutterites. So you can say that these were long time reactions to the influence of the crypto-Protestants.
Mm-hmm. So there was sort of ongoing tension, but it took time for it to develop. Yeah. I'm trying to square this new piety from the Pietists, which focuses more on internalized faith, with the more Anabaptist notion that faith should be expressed with outward living in material sense in the real world. And it seems to me they're a bit at odds. And so I'm expecting a little bit more conflict maybe than there was.
No, because it was not that much a contradiction as one might think. I think one always thinks that Protestantism, Pietism, and Anabaptism would never go together. But that was not the case. Because if you see the Protestants also living, Christian living, and the work and deeds were also important for Luther. He wrote a whole book about work, deeds and everything. And for a Christian, it's important to live a Christian life. So there was never grace alone among the Protestants, what we always think. And there was also never works alone for the Anabaptists, and not only Nachfolge. It is interesting when you compare the correspondence of the Hutterites and the Herrnhuter in the 18th century, and you look at the notions there, for example, at the notion of Bekehrung and Wiedergeburt, and you compare that to Peter Riedemann's Rechenschaft, you find there is a lot of similarity in these notions. So there is not that clash of ideas. That clash of ideas was somehow constructed afterwards, and it was more a clash that the historians wanted to see, but actually that clash was not there. There was good communication, and as I think when I read the sources, there is much in common regarding the notions and actually the faith and the belief. Because also, I mean, for the Anabaptists, it was also important. Nachfolge is important, but the inner spirit and the inner faith life is also important. And on the other side, for the Lutherans, it is grace, yes, but it's also a Christian should lead the life that a Christian should lead.
Mm-hmm. And the part you quoted about the invisible church of Jesus Christ in the Spirit is what we should try to aim at and try to understand and pursue. I wonder whether the early Anabaptists would have been as eager to say that as Johannes Waldner is here in the 18th century. He seems to be thinking more broadly in terms of who is a Christian and who is part of this movement than the earlier, more sectarian Hutterites would have granted. Is that fair?
Yep, right. I mean, the early Hutterites and no early Anabaptist group would have said that. I mean, they all had their exclusive idea of the church, and if you see or if you look into the writings of the 16th century, you even see that the various Anabaptist groups were exclusive in themselves. So there was no common Anabaptist theology or no common Anabaptist identity. It was the Hutterites, it was the Swiss Brethren, it was the Mennonites, and all could not work very well together.
Okay, yeah. Now, you mentioned that the Herrnhuter Brüdergemeinden, is it right that they were in Moravia, roughly where the early Hutterites settled?
No. They never were in Moravia. They were in Saxony, but they took in many refugees from Moravia. So that's That's why today in English-speaking countries, you have the Moravian Church. That's somehow misleading a little bit, because the Herrnhuter Brüdergemeinde was always in Saxony, but then doing a lot of mission work all over the world. They came to Newfoundland, to Africa, I don't know, already 18th century. So where they were very active, to Russia, where actually the Hutterites became aware of them. But their center was always in Saxony.
Okay. Mm-hmm. You mentioned that the folks who moved to Transylvania in 1622 to work for Gabor Bethlen, that they agreed to not practice any mission work. Did they agree to that in 1622 or later? And how do we account for that change in position? 16th century Hutterites were very aggressive missioners, and that even continued in the 18th century in many ways. How do we account for this change in evangelizing or in mission here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was typical for privileges, also privileges that the Mennonites got in the 17th, 18th century. It was typical policy in the early modern times from the 17th century on, 17th, 18th century. It was possible for Anabaptists or for persecuted groups to be tolerated, not because the law gave them toleration, but because several rulers and territorial princes invited them. They invited them, and then they gave them Privilegien, in German, privileges. And those privileges contained the toleration. You are allowed to settle here. You are allowed to live a non-resistant life. You don't have to go to war. You have to take up arms. And then was always, you are tolerated, but you are not allowed to do mission work. They wanted to tolerate the people, but avoid that they got the subjects of the rulers into their churches. So that was typical for these privileges. And well, we can see with the Hutterite Church, there is still some mission work in the 1620s in Tyrol. That's what we can say. There must have been also a bit of a mission work yet in the 17th century, but not in Transylvania, not in Upper Hungary, but in like here in the Palatinate, where they established this Bruderhof in Mannheim. In my opinion, this was one attempt to do some more mission work, but not where it was forbidden for them in Transylvania. There are other hints that there is a little bit mission work yet in the 17th century in Württemberg, but it's very, very rarely that mission work. And the one reason is that it was forbidden for them, but the other reason, it's difficult to say. I have never found some comment on that in the Geschichtsbuch or so. Maybe some of you know, then I would be glad if you give me the quotation why the Hutterites gave up mission work.
But we have Ehrenpreis with the Sendbrief in mid-century. Yeah. That's a mid-17th century. And so he's in Hungary, right? And then you have the people in Transylvania doing something kind of different. Like that seems to me a bit at odds that they would have had two different approaches to this question.
Well, actually, but Ehrenpreis was also in Transylvania. That was one church at that. It was Upper Hungary and it was Transylvania at that time.
Right, but Ehrenpreis would have lived in Upper Hungary, right?
Oh yeah, right. He was in Sabatisch. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, right.
He was the elder up there. He was writing the Sendbrief and sending folks out on mission. And meanwhile, you had the other part of the church in Transylvania agreeing to not continue mission work. That sounds to me quite interesting. That would have been the case. Yeah.
It is, though I'm not quite sure. I mean, politics changed in the 17th century. So I'm not sure if the Hutterites would have been free to revive mission work actually in Upper Hungary. But maybe to start, I mean, it was under Ehrenpreis that they started mission work again in Germany, yeah, in the Palatinate.
Yeah.
But I would think that it would also be difficult to have mission work directly in Upper Hungary.
Mhm.
Jesse, just speak. I just have to turn on the lights here. Just 1 minute. Sorry. Okay.
So we're speaking about Ehrenpreis. Here's a question about Ehrenpreis's admonitions. And we know he wrote a lot of Ordnungen and warnings and admonitions. Were those admonitions about the lack of spirituality, and you mentioned specifically disrespect toward leaders, were those justified? Do we have evidence, or is it just the case that the leaders are becoming more elite and privileged? And like, is the anti-clericalism among the Hutterites in Ehrenpreis's era, is it justified? What do you think?
Well, I mean, both. On the one hand, Ehrenpreis is the one who ends the, who always writes against too many privileges for the leaders. When you read the ordinances from Ehrenpreis, you have several ordinances that are directly against the servants of the word and the leaders. And he also ends a practice that was typical for the Hutterites in the 16th century, the zweifachen Ehren. It was very common for the Hutterites in the 16th century that the leaders had more privileges than the others. They had special food, they had a special table. It is always said they were dressed more luxury and more noble than the others. And Ehrenpreis is the one who wants to stop this zweifache Ehren. So he tries to give the church more equality again. But on the other side, I mean, that's always, you can still see that from the ordinances, what Ehrenpreis has to address didn't work well. And there you still see that some of the elders saw himself as better than the others. But in my impression, Ehrenpreis was the one who wanted to have more equality again.
Yes, Peter Riedemann writes a long letter in defense of that zweifache Ehre principle. But he would have butted heads with Ehrenpreis, and I'm happy to say that I would have sided with Ehrenpreis on that one. Yeah, a question about the anti-Trinitarians. We know that there are a number of them that joined the Hutterites. Can you say more about maybe why they were attracted to the Hutterites, or why the Hutterites would have even allowed them to come and join, given their doctrinal views? What do we know about anti-Trinitarians joining the Hutterites?
Well, I mean, we know that with some it worked, with some not, like Georg Geissi, who took with him some of the Hutterite property. Why did they allow them in? I mean, actually, in the 17th century, the Hutterites allowed many into their church, and they didn't hesitate to get into theological discussions, also with the anti-Trinitarians. There are some letters being written back and forth. And we also know that some anti-Trinitarians visited the Hutterites, and actually they were attracted by the system, by community of goods. Though there's also one report of anti-Trinitarians portraying or describing the Hutterite system, which is very anti-sympathetic. They write the Hutterites are living like slaves, and they are only workers. They have a very strong working ethics, and well, actually are more a system of workers and an economic system than a spiritual system. That's one perception we have of the Hutterite system, which also shows how important the whole economic system was at that time, still in the 17th century.
Yeah, that's also something that all of us are familiar with, that critique today. We have a fair number of educators here on today, and it strikes me that when there's a crisis in society, one of the things that often gets blamed for the crisis is the schools, the educator, the education system. If I wanted to ask a question that kind of connects to a last lecture, you sort of attribute the decline in large part to the prosperity in the communities. I'm wondering, is there a case to be made that the schools the Hutterites had in the 16th century, as good as they were initially, that they may be partly to blame for the decline of the community in the late 16th, early 17th century? Do we know enough to make that argument or that case?
We actually don't know that much about the schools in the late 17th century, but what we read is that
16th century, late 16th century, early 17th century.
We know most of the things we know about the schools are from the 16th and early 17th century. And then in the later 17th and early 18th century, there we don't know that much about the schools as from the 16th century. I mean, yeah, there is, I think there's a general rule that Reformation or Renewal or also the recatholization in Moravia started with the schools. When the Jesuits came to Moravia in the 16th century, the first thing they did was to establish schools, good schools, that the children of the Protestant nobles were sent to these schools. Then they could start to recatholize the children. And when the children were recatholized, then it started to spread into the families. So it is often the strategy to start with the schools. And the Hutterites had good schools in the 16th century, but around 1600 or then early 17th century, we read in the ordinances that the schools didn't work very well anymore. That obviously the teacher were not enthusiastic anymore. What I quoted today, even under Andreas Ehrenpreis, he says that the school teachers are no role models anymore for the children. It is said that the teachers didn't care enough about the children. The education was not good enough anymore. They sometimes even neglected their job, did other things and left the children in the schools and did other things. So that's what we read about the decline of the Hutterite schools. There was never a revival of the good system that had been there in the 16th century.
Yeah, sorry if I may just interrupt briefly. If you look at the Ordnungen, the Schulordnung, the first one comes out in 1558 already, suggesting some issues in the schools. Then you get one every 10 years up to the end of the 16th century, which suggests to me that there are some pretty serious challenges, at least, in the schools, which makes me wonder about that factor in all of this.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, not only the school ordinances, the schools and the teachers are also addressed in the general ordinances, partly, yeah. So I think you are right, yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Kenny, if you want to jump in here and ask a question while I read what's going on here in the chat, you are certainly free to do that. Maybe a question about how the political situation in Transylvania and Hungary was different than in Moravia in terms of how the Hutterites interacted and associated with the lords. Was the relationship more or less the same in Transylvania, Hungary, than it was in Moravia, or are there significant differences that we know?
Well, I mean, the main difference is the number of the church and the church members. I mean, you had in Moravia, you had what did I say last time? Either 58 or 53 or whatever colonies on several estates in southern Moravia. So you have many more Hutterites, many more nobles that were the landlords of the Hutterites. So you have many more interaction between the Hutterites and the nobles in Moravia than in Transylvania. And in Transylvania, I mean, you had four colonies or so. So it's you can't compare both situations regarding that.
So, but there was more or less the same kind of feudal relationship between the lords of the land?
Sure, I mean, everything is economy. And so also the nobles or Bethlen Gabor, the Transylvanian prince, they knew what they got when they invited the Hutterites. And they knew when you have good craftsmen, good subjects, then the economy prospers, and it's to the advantage of your own rulership and the advantage of your own sovereignty. So that was always the case, and that's also what Bethlen Gabor knew in the 17th century.
Yeah, and I've always been familiar that the Hutterites were relied on for their crafts. But in your book, From the Tyrol to North America, that's the English version, you write about how in Alvins, in Transylvania, the relationship between the lords and the Hutterites was even bigger, beyond the trades. I'm going to quote just a little passage here and get you to react to that, maybe a bit more about that. Besides plying their trades, Hutterites from Alvins were once more involved in the administration and politics of the Transylvanian nobility. They served not only as spiritual advisors for George Kautsky I and for Katharina von Brandenburg, the widow and political successors to Gabor Bethlen, but also as treasurers in the country's finance department. In addition, they offered their services as diplomatic advisors. So I've got diplomatic advisors, I've got financial treasurers, I've got advisors, spiritual advisors to the nobility. Wow, that's a pretty impressive list beyond the traditional crafts. Can you say more about the level of engagement and the kinds of relationships you're describing here?
Yeah, I would love to, Jesse. Well, that's what you read. That's what I found in the sources. And it shows that the Hutterites were engaged in political affairs. We know this also from the beginning of the 30 Years' War in Moravia. The Hutterites were also there active in carrying letters from Moravia to other parts of Germany. So that was another side of Hutterite mission work at that time, that they were also postmen for the diplomatic correspondence at that time, because they were in very good contact with the Protestant nobles. And I mentioned the rebellion of the Protestant nobles in Moravia at the beginning of the 30 Years' War. And they installed an own king there for only a very little time. Then the Habsburgs took over again. But at that time, the Hutterites were on the side of the Protestants in Moravia, and they they were involved in carrying diplomatic letters, etc. And then we have the things you read in Transylvania. Unfortunately, the whole period of the Hutterites in Transylvania is longing for more research, especially if somebody would go to Romania today and look into the archives and see if there are sources. That's highly needed, because most of the things we tell about the Hutterites in Transylvania is from the Kleingeschichtbuch and 2 or 3 other sources that we have. But it would be highly needed to go into the archives in Romania and look what can be found there about the Hutterite history in this part of Europe.
Have you ever been there yourself, in those archives?
No, unfortunately not. Yep.
Well, I'll have to come over to Germany and go there with you.
Yeah, sure. You're welcome.
Yeah. All right. Well, this about wraps up our allotted time. Unless there's a pressing question somebody eagerly needs to ask to make it through the weekend, we will wrap it up for this week. And glad to say that there's 2 more lectures in the next 2 weeks where we can continue this discussion about tradition versus renewal and finding that balance. And I just want to throw out this quotation here for all of us to think about in the next couple of weeks, maybe years, about tradition. And it's from Gustav Mahler. Many of you probably know it. Tradition ist nicht die Anbetung der Asche, sondern die Bewahrung des Feuers. Tradition is not the worshiping of the ashes, but the keeping of the fire. And the question I just want to pose to everybody, you don't have to comment on it now if you don't want to, although you sure are welcome to. Why is it so difficult to distinguish between the ashes and the fire? So, Kenny, if you have any housekeeping items you want to address before we leave off today?
Yes, I do. First of all, let me extend a very, very warm thank you to Astrid for another very engaging lecture rooted in a time period where, as you pointed out, the sources still need to be explored. If there are any PhD students out there, this would be a wonderful area that they could use to, get a trip to Romania. I also want to thank all the attendees. Thank you for joining us. It's for you that this lecture has been put together. This week has also seen some very, very generous contributions through the website to sustain this lecture series. We're very, very grateful for that. And we do encourage that. To attend is free, but we appreciate the support. Jesse mentioned that there are 2 more lectures. If you've signed up on the website within the last week, there's no need for you to sign up again. You will get a reminder on Saturday to give you the link again so that you can just click on it and then it's going to be there. We will also use the email address that you've signed up with to send you Astrid's slides. So if these slides are of interest to you and you've only, clicked the link which was shared on social media, head over to jdmlectures.org and sign up to make sure that you get those slides. As I mentioned last week, please make sure that you talk about these lectures and its content with your friends and community members. Let's think about these ideas. There is much here that we must learn, and it's fascinating that, history may not repeat itself, but it sure rhymes, doesn't it? The things that Astrid brings up are oddly familiar. We live in such a time as well. So go in peace, and I hope to see all of you next week again.